Hello and welcome to Bangladesh Feminist Oral History Project, an initiative by Bangladesh Feminist Archives. I'm Tanvir Anoy and I'm honored to host today's conversation. This project is dedicated to preserving the voices of feminists and social justice advocates who have shaped and continue to shape movements in Bangladesh. Through these conversations, we document their journeys, challenges, and contributions, ensuring that their work lives beyond the moment. For this episode, we are honored to feature Myat Moe Khaing, an Indigenous researcher, storyteller, and rights advocate from the Chittagong Hill Tracts. Mia's academic work focuses on the lived experiences of urban indigenous women in Dhaka, where she explored how gender, migration, labor, aspiration, and autonomy are negotiated in an environment shaped by class, ethnic, and linguistic hierarchies. Her master's thesis at Bragg University, completed with high distinction, remains one of the few sustained studies on urban indigenous womanhood in contemporary Bangladesh. Mia spent 7 years in corporate sector, navigating complex dynamics of identity, belonging, and representation. Her experiences there led her to reconsider what meaningful, values-driven work looks like. In a deliberate and thoughtful shift, she is now pursuing a Master's of Social Work in Australia, supported by the Vice Chancellor's International Scholarship. This transition reflects her desire to work in ways that are grounded in care, community, accountability, and culturally rooted healing practices. Alongside her academic and professional work, she has contributed to mother tongue education and indigenous storytelling initiatives, including translating oral histories such as the Legend of Boga Lake and helping develop learning materials for indigenous children to preserve linguistic and cultural continuity. Today, she shares her journey through identity, research, work, transition, language, and home. So Mia, let's start with your journey. Growing up as an indigenous person or Adivasi person, what early experiences shaped your relationship to identity and belonging?
Hi, Anoy. Thank you so much for inviting me to your beautiful talk and session today. I think it's such an honor that you think my voice is an invaluable input to the discourse, and I'm very glad to take part in that. Um, Thinking about upbringing when I was growing up, when I look back right now, I realize how complex it was, especially at this age. My mom is Rakhine and my dad is Marma. So they are not from the same community, but they're very close and similar. So I had to I grew up with much of an influence from both sides. My mom is from um, an island and my dad is from the hill tracts. So that kind of also shaped the way I look at the world. I would say, first of all, that although I'm an indigenous person, I have been extremely privileged all my life. I have had access to education, even education in English language, which gave me much of a boost in advancing education and career and accessing opportunities throughout. But when I was young, I think there's always a distinction between people who come across different identities at different stages of life. So, for example, if you are a child and you do not have, and your environment, your parents, family never taught you racism, you really accept people. Versus if you grow up and at a much later stage in your life, you come across people from different identities, you may find it difficult to accept people. So, when I went to school, my friends never discriminated against me. My teachers never discriminated against me because didn't feel different at all because of them, and I'm very thankful for that. And it was a much of a very ingrained upbringing in that case. But as I was growing older, I think I did start realizing that there were hierarchies in Bangladesh because Bangladesh itself being so homogeneous, it hit me hard later. For example, I remember always asking, like, why do we have such big holidays for Muslims, but such small holidays for Buddhists? For like Buddhists, we only have Buddha Purnima, which is just one day. But I always thought about, why can't we have holidays on New Year's? Why can't we have holidays on Probarona Purnima, which is in October? You know, these are such big events. Why can't I go and visit my larger family back home? And as I was growing older, especially when I went to cadet college. When I went to cadet college uh, at my preteens, it was then when I met people from all over Bangladesh. By all over Bangladesh, I mean people from villages, cities, big cities, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And it was also then at that point, I didn't really realize how much people knew less about me, because I also figured that I didn't know much about other people. I didn't know much about someone from Wanchogor. I didn't know, have never met someone from, say, Rajshahi back then. But there were times when people tried to really box me. And I think it happens, especially when you get into an older age. Even back in school, I remember one of my friends, like when you're in school, you always play games with whatever you have, right? Like with papers. Um, One of my friends would come up and say, like, if you think about religions, do you know what the best religion is? And I'm like, I don't know what the best religion is. And he would say, it's Islam, because he was Muslim and he was taught so. And then he would come to different conclusions about how his religion was better. For example, he would play this game. For example, when you fold your hands like this, it shows that you're praying to Hindu gods. And then when you do this, you're praying to, I'm sorry, it was something like, when you fold your hands this way, you're praying to God in Christianity. And when you do this, you pray to God in Buddhism. But that's not how we prayed. And then he said, this is how you pray in Hinduism, and this is how you do it in Islam. So all the kind of stories, all kind of progression would ultimately lead to a conclusion that their culture or their religion was better. And I think at that point, they didn't understand that it could be discriminatory at that point. And I also didn't have the voice to even refute that, because I would probably just, at many cases, just accept it at face value at that time. And as later it progressed, I think people did come up to me and ask about, like, what is it like to be from the hills? Like, what kind of food do you have? And sometimes these questions, now that I understand, it's probably not intentioned to be racist, but they would ask a lot about my food habits, like curiosity about, like, do you really eat frogs, and do you eat, say, snakes? But I didn't know at that point, especially when you're young, you're not equipped to really come up with um, very intelligent responses. But I did struggle with that. But however, I felt like throughout the time, I have struggled educating myself, and also had this responsibility to always educate others. You know, especially when others don't have that responsibility, it makes a big difference.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. So my next question is to you would be, so when you moved to Dhaka, and how did your understanding of yourself as an indigenous person shift or transform?
Uh, my parents, I would say, they have tried to really be very protective about me. Like in most indigenous cases, indigenous families, I moved to Dhaka fairly later in life. I came to Dhaka in 2013 when I completed my HSC, and my parents always wanted to keep me in bubble. They were those parents who, they had struggled in their lives. They had seen different kind of realities, and they felt that it was very important for me to focus on my career, on my education, and to stay out of politics, stay out of political discussions, especially in Bangladesh, where it's very heavily discouraged to be involved in any kind of matter that challenge the system, that challenge the government. So they did try to keep me in that bubble, but I think I was always curious about my own origin, my own identity, because I felt like even in textbooks, I never saw my reflection. My the reflection of my identity in textbooks were so reductive. Like, for example, I remember in class 6, in standard 6, we had this book on Bangla first paper, and then later in social sciences, which was about Bangladesh has this many upajatis. These are the tribes. They look like this and eat like this. That's it. There wasn't much deeper. There wasn't much about our philosophy or how we thought or the context of our practices. So that did make me very curious. And when I came to Dhaka, and Dhaka is such a mega city. It is so big, and you may feel like you're gonna get lost. And when I came to Dhaka, I was in FarmGate at that point because I was pursuing my admission coaching centers. And FarmGate does have diaspora of indigenous communities. And this indigenous communities often like stayed within themselves. And that also made me very curious about like, why do these people just stay within themselves? Are they not open to others? Or is it the external world that do not want to mingle with them? And that those were the questions that I always had. But as I was growing up, I think I had the influence. I was very fortunate that I had access to different progressive bubbles who would look at me and empathize with me. I was getting more exposures to what was happening back in the Chittagong Hill Tracts through news and different alternative media outlets that was not necessarily from the dominant news medias, for example, like Prathamal or Daily Star. It was through CHT run media outlets that was getting to understand what was happening in the hill tracts and from a very different lens. And at that point, I was also getting introduced to different student councils, indigenous student councils in Dhaka University. And that kind of gave me an idea of what was happening in the bigger picture. And it really made me question because I was studying at IBA and it's like such a small bubble, and I was studying business, which was very, centered around just business. I kind of at that point started feeling drawn towards causes. And I felt like I was, I had this, I was walking between worlds where one was about like participating in business competitions, talking about revenue and all of that. The other was about justice. It's about all the injustices that was happening to the indigenous communities. For example, the rapes that were not talked about, the fights, the attacks on indigenous communities, and that was opening my eyes to bigger systematic issues, which I was at that point starting to connect with my personal life and seeing the patterns in my family.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And I'm so happy that like you are sharing this journey and sharing your particular story with us. My next question is for you is that what drew you to work with mother tongue storytelling and children language materials?
Hey, thank you. I am. I'm not sure if the word would be guilty or if the word is shame, because I think the feeling is very complex. As I said, Onoi, I had access to opportunities that were denied to most members of my community. I can speak English fluently. I also write in English. Many people in Bangladesh struggle doing that, and I hold that reality with both gratitude and discomfort at the same time. But that came at a cost. I can speak in my mother tongue. I can speak in both Rakhine and Marma, but I do not know how to write in that language. And that's very, that questions your existence, your survival. Because when you grow up, especially when you're like, say, studying literature, or even in Bangla language, uh, even in the subjects, we have such repetitive topics where we have to write on how our existence is intertwined with mother language, and motherland, right? Because we had a lot of topics on patriotism. And it made me question, but where is my mother tongue? Why is that not in the picture? And I did have access to even learning Bengali with private tutors because I wasn't very good at it. But it was never the case with Rakhine language. It was always, it was always like at considered secondary when it came to my education. It was so competitive. My parents were so focused on that. But they also focused on me being fluent in my language. But in the process, learning in my mother tongue to write in my mother tongue was lost. And I felt very guilty, and I always felt like the system always had subtractive language learning, where you have to learn one language at the cost of other. But you can learn multiple languages. That's proven. Like, people learn multiple languages at the same time, and if you have access to learning in your mother language, that actually improves your learning. That's even been proven by different research. So I was at a later stage, when I was in university during my undergrad, I joined a project called Out of Our Golden Hour. What we do is we go to the hill tracts and we partner with different schools. And most of the time, the schools can be very local schools. Like, for example, some schools are run by monasteries, like Buddhist monasteries, or orphanages run by Buddhist monasteries, because they have like localized education and access to the communities. So we would go to the schools, and we would go and say, children, I'm sure you have heard of different folklore, different stories. Like, for example, in Bangla, we have Tuna Tuni version, right? This folklore, these stories are probably told to you by your parents or grandparents. We want you to go home, interview your parents and grandparents, come back and share those stories with us. So they would come back, stand in front of the whole class, and share those stories. And we would um, record those stories, and later we would like transcribe, translate, and publish those stories in books. We would use illustrations that featured people like us, because when you look at Bengali books, they don't represent people like us, and they're not told by people like us. And then when we translate and publish those books, we distribute it among schools. So what it does is, it does few things. It is preserving those languages. Certain languages are in the process of extinction. It's being deliberately driven to extinction. So how does a language die? If your critical mass of people speaking that language, if that is under the critical mass, the language is in the risk of going extinct. So we want to protect those languages. So like some languages, and especially in indigenous communities, you would see that we all have a lot of oral traditions, right? It's knowledge is passed or orally. And so a oral tradition has to be preserved and has to be honored, that gets lost in Western or in dominant systems. So we want to preserve that. We want to preserve the language, the alphabets, before the last people who knows how to write those alphabets die as well. And thirdly, we also want children to learn in their mother tongue. So for example, if you think, suppose you're a Mro person, you speak Mro at home, and then you travel very far, you walk miles and miles, and then you go to school, and then you suddenly come across a different language, and you do not even know what that means. As a result of that, you are likely to drop out because you don't understand that language. Best cases, you can probably read that language, but you cannot comprehend that language because there is no fluency, there is no structural support. So what we try to do is we try to keep these children in school by providing education in mother tongue, and side by side, they can also learn language. They can also access education in other languages, because if you just directly put them in other languages, they are likely to fail. So that's what we do. We try to preserve those languages as well, the stories, because those stories carry a lot of traditional values. It reflect the time and the communities of what they hold dear, and the stories that speaks about them. Yeah.
And thank you so much for your work. It's really, really, really important. And thank you so much for doing that work. So my next question for you is that why is language so important for memory, cultural continuity, and emotional connection in indigenous communities?
I love this question. I think one of the reasons why human species have progressed, advanced so well is because of language, because of how we could communicate complex ideas to each other and coordinate, cooperate among us, and believe in different fictions and achieve things. But language is also how we learn the meaning of the world. That's very critical. If you think about the case of Bangladesh or the language Bangla, why did people in 1952 fight for this language? Why were people ready to die? Why did Pakistan decide to dominate a language? Why did Pakistan impose Urdu on East Pakistan? It's because language is not just intertwined with survival, it's also very strategic. If you want to kill a community, if you want to push a community to extinction, the first step is to do it via language, is to attack that language so that that community loses their sense of self, so that that community loses their knowledge, their traditions, and it gets lost. And that's why language is so important. And language is, it sets all kind of context. For example, last week I was talking to the Marma Queen, Ukeng. She was telling me about how in Marma language, or even in like Chittagong Hill Tracts, rape, the word rape, there is no equivalence of the word rape in Marma language. It's because in our community, rape was something that people could never imagine, because that was not a part of our traditions, our culture. That was not something that was a part of our shared reality. So when you look at justice, and when you have to like look at justice in terms of, say, reporting cases, this is where Indigenous communities often struggle with traditional systems, because traditional systems do not recognize Indigenous customs. And Indigenous customs are often so forced to confront atrocities by dominant systems. So language shapes reality. Language is how intricately linked to our brain development and how we look at the world. So language is also through what we transfer intergenerational knowledge. And if you kill that, that medium of transmission of knowledge will also be lost. And that's why language is so important, not just for Indigenous communities, for any community.
Though those are very, very strong words, that's for sure, right? And I think that's really interesting whenever you kind of like, utter that, like, there's no equivalent word for rape, right, in that language. So that's fascinating to hear that. So I will move to the next question, and it's for you. Is that so? What has storytelling allowed you to express or protect that other forms of communication cannot?
Stories are never just about stories, it's about the people, it's about the time, it's about everything. Other forms of communication are often reductionist. Like there is always a very different lens of someone observing you and telling a story about you. And often that story is very exoticized, right? For example, just think about, I think even in August, I wrote about Coke Studios' Baji song, right? It's a very Bengali gaze of how this song, the original song, was taken out of context and put that, and they were used in Coke Studios context. And that comes up with so many different threats of how you could be exoticized by a different person, by a different community, of how cultural relativism could be lost, of like how some traditions or practices are interpreted in your culture, in your language, is so different from a different context. And that's why it's so important for you to tell the story, because A, it records the truth. It honors the truth telling. B, it does justice to the context. And C, it is a lot about power as well, right? So you claim your power to yourself instead of someone else telling that story for you. So in that case, dominant systems, dominant ways, even when they have the best intentions, does not do a good service to that. So it's best to always tell your own story?
Yeah, I think storytelling is a really powerful tool, right? Through storytelling, it kind of like, deconstruct that dominant narrative, right? It has a free flow. It kind of gives you the uniqueness and authenticity to express yourself, really, right? But what I really want to say, like, there's always a lot of criticism about storytelling as well, that like it's being very, like, linear, like very basic, right? But I always rejected that norm, but still I'm so happy that like you use storytelling as one of your, like, unique powers to like to express yourself and also in your work. Thank you. Yeah. So,
For example, like, why do you do your work? Like, why are you asking me to tell my story?
oh, you're asking me.
There to
Like I'm a very big fan of storytelling because of like I think I come from a, like a culture of, or like I would say structure of, like I was being told that like everything has to be structured and your thoughts, everything has to go through a like a rules and regulation. And I remember when I used to like to read short stories, fiction stories, and people used to make fun of me and saying that literature has no value, storytelling has no value. I mean, storytelling can be obviously fiction and non-fiction, right? And I think particularly when I remember that, like I was being told to like to talk about myself. I always being told that like you have to be poised, you have to like to make sure that like you are not oversharing anything. Those rules and regulations, I always feel like those are like kind of like doesn't make any sense. Like I believe that as a person, I need to like to tell a story in a way where I feel that I can express myself, right? Like that's why I'm not very much into interviews, because interviews are very structured, and that's why the one of the key reasons of doing feminist oral history and also doing your oral history is that giving you, like, not giving you, I would say, like, I'm trying to like to like initiate a situation where I can also hear and also learn from you, right? And also this learning process has been shared with like like others, right? So yeah, that would be my answer.
that. So thank you for sharing that, Onai.
No, thank you so much. I was being a little bit awkward because I was like, oh wow, I was being questioned. So that was like, what
Yeah.
happened, right? But no, thank you so much for asking me that question. And I think it we really need to like to talk about more about storytelling, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Um, so your research focuses on urban indigenous women navigating life in Dhaka. So what are some of the insights of patterns that emerged in your conversations with this woman?
I love it. I love the question. I feel like, Onai, much of literature on the hill tracts is always about what's happening in the hill tracts, in the region of hill tracts, in that geographical territory. But because of my growing up, my upbringing, and I have always felt like I was walking between worlds and not feeling like I belong to either. I felt like I couldn't relate my experiences to my peers who were mostly Bengalis. And when I looked at indigenous peoples, there were not many around. And we had like very vastly different experiences. So I was very inclined towards unearthing experiences like mine, to intellectualize experiences like mine, and to see the structural issues pertaining to it. So, particularly indigenous women, I would say, is very much a central topic in literature because women are always tied with the reproductive capacity. So in they are usually the expressions, the vibrant expressions of their culture. So there's always much focus, which also means in any kind of um, conflict, women become special targets because the enemies want to attack women's wombs because of their reproductive capacity. And that I kind of like tried to intertwine with migration, being in urban areas, access to education, and what it looked like. When I was growing up, I was very fortunate. I came across Intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw. And although her context was about critical race theory and the context in America, Black people, I could see how I could use that in understanding my reality. So I interviewed a few people. I had a case study approach, and I found three emerging themes. One was about education. So when it came to education, you would see, even when I was growing up, I could relate to it that a lot of people would look at me and say, "Oh, you don't have to worry much. You have quota. It's easy. You'll just get in, and you don't have to study even much. You do not need to have like very high grades because they just allow you in, right?" And words like affirmative action, quota, kind of became very present in my life, and I didn't know how to feel about it. And I was constantly in doubt of my capability. I was not sure if I was smart enough, or if I belonged to any room. I was very fortunate that I had access to good quality education in Bangladeshi standards, but I always doubted myself. And even to an extent, I decided to go to IBA because they didn't have quota. And I wanted to prove to myself that I can get into places that was completely based on meritocracy. So in my research, I did find out that was also a recurring theme where a lot of my my interviewees were dubious about their own intellect. So they felt like they were not good enough. But on the other hand, when they looked at when I looked at how the kind of reaction they received from their community, it was different. Within their community, they were considered people who were very privileged. So they were the ones who were accessing the affirmative action policies and opportunities, which other indigenous members, for example, those who were from, let's say, like lower margin or more marginalized groups, they didn't have access to that affirmative action. So many members of that community kind of despised the ideas of privileged indigenous communities to accessing affirmative action. So that was based on completely on perception. So I'm talking about perception, not necessarily about facts, about whether or not that this person is privileged. It's just that most indigenous communities would consider these beneficiaries to be very privileged, and once they had access to it, the communities would often make indigenous struggles synonymous with, say, poverty, because that has been the case. Like indigenous peoples are the highest in terms of poverty, illiteracy. When it came to employment, it was also the same. They did face a lot of racism in workplaces, or like curiosity about their food habits and all of that. But the I spent a big chunk on understanding the choice of partner. So you see, in usually in other communities, the topic of when you want to get married comes later. Usually when the person has come of age. I'm talking about, say, South Asian communities, because our cultures are so similar. But for indigenous women, I'm not talking about indigenous men, I'm talking about indigenous women, their reality is a double sword. A, when they grow up, they the families realize that indigenous women have been so badly targeted in conflicts where they have been raped, where they have been disappeared. They want to protect the women. And a way to protect the women is by making sure that they never have to be with Bengali men or the men from the dominant group with a historical tie of violating these women and their communities. So what they do is, from a very young age, they do not they do not want to send the girls to schools, but with time we have seen that education has been very largely accepted. Families have endorsed education, but they also see that educating your daughter means there's a very high chance that your daughter will marry outside the community. And that's a very big threat. But they don't see that much of a problem with Indigenous boys. And why so? Because, especially in any conservative society, you will see that if women are so scrutinized, they are held, always under constant supervision. They come up with their own strategy of working hard so that they can, have freedom, they can enjoy a life they want, so they become very motivated. Whereas in patriarchy, boys do not have that pressure, so they can become, say, entitled. They work less hard. And Indigenous women themselves are very hardworking. Even if you look at, say, june cultivation, they're extremely hardworking. So Indigenous women often surpass Indigenous men in terms of success, like traditional success, academic success, employment. And in patriarchy, once again, when Indigenous women become more successful than Indigenous men, the community thinks that the Indigenous women do not find suitable Indigenous men that's compatible with her intellectual capability. So they try to look out the community. That's the perception of the Indigenous community. So they here in this case, they hold the women accountable instead of asking why the men are not doing well, right? And B, they also hold the women where the women have to make a choice between individual freedom, where they can choose whoever they want, versus collective survival. So they hold the women as a collective survival tool. So if you are a woman, think about patriarchy, right? If you have a daughter and a son, if your daughter marries someone outside the community, then she's marrying out. She's the one who has to convert to another religion, to another culture. But in patriarchy, if your son marries someone even outside the community, because of patriarchy, he brings another woman in. So that woman is converted, that woman comes into your family, the blood lineage is carried through that woman, but for your family. So you see, like, it's also very gendered at the same time. So what the community comes up with the strategy is that um, we can educate the women. Of course, we want to educate the women, but we may have to fix their marriage early on. So we will give someone, so we will like say, uh, because if you are educating your daughter, the community comes and says, oh, by the way, since you're educating your daughter, there is a risk of her marrying outside the community. So what you do is you come up with a strategy of fixing the marriage early. You can just fix the marriage early, or you can get her engaged and she will get married later on. But there's always this pressure. So you cannot be seen on social media with Bengali men or with men from other cultures. And there's always this scrutiny of people like checking your profile, seeing whether you are around. And even in Indigenous communities, there's a lot of slut shaming of Indigenous women. And especially, I think even like recent years, you have seen that women are being called out because their profiles or their videos on TikTok with people from other culture, with being around or like dating men or even being friendly around them, around Bengali men, have been heavily scrutinized, right? And these women also kind of grow up with some form of conditional love, where they, from a very young age, even before their teenage, they are looked at as considerable threats by their communities. And that's what my research tried to focus on. So how do you balance between, say, individual freedom and this collective thinking of survival? And like, I think at some point you do realize when you look back, for example, like Kalpana Chakman, like so many women have gone through gendered violence. And this is not disconnected from the structural realities of, like, say, national violence, of state enabled violence that is linked, this macro elements, and how it links to micro experiences in Indigenous communities.
Thank you. So how do Indigenous women navigate movement, livelihood, autonomy, and safety in the city?
In the city, I think what I really like about cities is that in cities you can be a no one. And that's the beauty of it. So especially when you come from a village or a small town, everyone knows everyone, right? And you'll usually hear from your friends who grew up in small towns. It's like they don't have like a sense of privacy. Everyone knows, like, if you are hanging out, if you bunked a class. But when you come to cities, even for like say people like say garment workers, right? It can be thrilling. Like, oh, it's big opportunities, but also people, um, no one knows you, so you can be your own person. So I have in my research I found that because women often like survive the present in the hopes of the future. They know that, okay, the future awaits, I have to do extremely well, so they work hard. They work hard. For example, they can be people who are working as say a salesperson at Arong, right? They are very dedicated to being themselves. They also face a lot of, say, exoticization of people from Bengali people. Even at work, they will get asked out or proposals uh, just based on their skin tone of being, being told that they don't look like Bengali people. They have like flat nose, very straight hair, bright yellow skin. So there is also this fetishization that is once again very much linked to gender-based violence. And how this indigenous women often strategizes, they linger on to education, because education becomes a form of passport. Education becomes your friend in achieving your autonomy, in achieving however you want. But these women do, once again, if they make decisions and if they decide to marry outside community, they face ostracization from their families. That has been a big trend. Many indigenous women who married outside the community have been ostracized. They have been disconnected from their families, but some families have accepted them. Even you will see that, especially many women who even go abroad, probably marry outside foreigners, outsiders, and some of them have been accepted. So it's very complex, and it really depends on how that women strategize. But once again, not all indigenous communities are same. There is also a hierarchy. For example, like the highest education rate would be say in Chakma. You will see Chakma people everywhere in the world. Even if you go to Greenland, I'm sure you'll find them. But versus say um, someone from say Tonchonga community, right, is way more marginalized. So the acceptance of that community is also dependent on the community's availability of resources and context.
Thank you. So my next question is to you is that how did your own experience in Dhaka shape the way you listen to, interpret it, and tell the stories of others?
Uh, I think it's still a continuous process. I think it's still being shaped as I'm in Australia right now. In Dhaka, I would say, oh no, I have been so privileged and fortunate that I've had like very supportive friends. And because of my work, I was constantly being introduced to people like you, people who had like similar outlook towards the world, people who were activists, advocates. Uh, and through them, I have learned about advocacy. Through them, I have learned about allyship. And especially if you are growing up as an indigenous person, if you look at the news, it's very difficult to even look at the news, right? Think about what happened in September 2024, what happened this year, a few days ago, what happened to Chingma Kiang, and the kind of racism that has come up on Facebook of people calling us separatists, people demanding we need to be controlled, we have to be dehumanized. Um, in those cases, I would say I have held onto curiosity. For example, once I one of my recurring experiences is like meeting people and constantly asking, this person is nice, but I wonder what their political opinion is on indigenous communities. And it's the same question you have about all kinds of political opinions. What do this person think about, say, I don't know, like structural issues? What do this person think about, say, women's rights or body autonomy? And that kind of makes a big difference in the kind of compatibility you have with people. I have also many times been so angry with my friends because they didn't know. And now I realize that in their journey of how they were brought up, they were never exposed to certain topics in their lives. They they were just like, products of their time, of whatever exposure they had, just like you and I are. We are also products. And it's a lot of unlearning, relearning that requires us. But Dhaka itself, being so diverse, is a place where you can see so much diversity in opinions. I have, like, for example, even the woman who worked at my house. She took care of me, my khala, back in Dhaka. She never discriminated against me based on my ethnicity. Um, the guard in my building, he never did that. Even the staffs in my former workplace, they never did that. Many of my colleagues are absolutely wonderful, but they do come and ask questions. But, like, I think when you come from a place of being pushed towards marginalization, and when you understand structural realities, and when you look at someone who is also marginalized, but not necessarily marginalized the way you are, for example, someone could be, I don't know, say like a refugee, you could still connect to them because you sometimes, those structural realities can be so overwhelming, right? Sometimes I feel like, think about, say, imperialism. I feel like imperialism itself is such a big wave, and it's coming onto you. It's like a tsunami, and you don't know what to do, and you do not know what kind of hope you can have. But even, like, say, in Australia, when I'm here, I was speaking to someone who was a second generation Syrian Australian, and I could easily connect because he and I, we both have gone through similar experiences, not the same, but of facing very structural realities. And I think that was my biggest learning from my time in Dhaka.
Thank you. So, you talked about a lot of, like, lived experiences. Like, it's so hard to, like, to pinpoint and, like, ask, like, sub questions as well, but I'm so enjoying this conversation. So I would go to the next question. So you spent several years working in a corporate sector, right? So what did that period teach you about identity, representation, and self-prevention? Sorry,
Uh,
preservation. I'm
okay.
sorry.
Yeah. Thank you, Onai. I worked in one of the biggest corporates in Bangladesh. I was very, very fortunate. Um, in During my time in Dhaka, Onai, it acted as a shield. I cannot not disown ever that part of the big role it played in my life. Um, Financial freedom is a very big deal in our lives, right? It can offset a lot of disadvantages we have. And when I was choosing my workplace, I also wanted to be at a workplace which had some kind of, like, connection with sustainability, like, the good feels that makes you feel good about yourself. Oh, this is the place I work at. Um, but initially, the beginning of my career, I was working at very different parts of the value chain. I worked at pricing, forecasting, roadmap. I felt very disconnected. I felt like, how you read about the alienation theory in Karl Marx, about how like, workers are disconnected from their own work, from other workers, from themselves, and all of that. I feel that. And later, I was quite fortunate. I also moved to marketing. I was running different kinds of campaigns. But through every part, like, even my employers could sense that I was very impact driven. So they would try to give me portfolios that was impact driven. For example, when I was looking at pricing, they would give me the portfolio of, say, enterprise, where I can, like, say, through my price planning, I can, say, help different enterprises access internet, make it, like, say, sustainable. And even when I was looking at partnerships, I used to look at value-driven partnerships, for example, healthcare. I was very fortunate I could drive conversations on mental health, um, our friendships with other animals like Bondhu Boche Amake, and all of that. And that was a constant anchor, because if I didn't do that, I would probably feel that like I would lose myself. But during my tenure at corporations, I was also able to witness how corporations think. And I think especially if you are working um, in social justice, rights advocacy, it's vital to understand how different entities think and to not take it personally. For example, like corporations will work if it makes sense in terms of money, right? If it like, how do brands work? Like, what are the brand strategies? What kind of messages do brands work on? And how do you connect your message to that? And how do you, like, say, if you want to talk to, say, a CEO and convince them about something, how do you anchor that conversation? That has been probably one of my biggest learnings. So as an outsider, when you're not working at corporations, you may think, oh, capitalism bad, neoliberalism bad, all of that. But when you go inside your workplace, I mean, as much as there is a structural thing, your colleagues are people like you, right? Like, they're everyday people. They care about their families. They want to lead a good life, and that they're not necessarily corrupted. They're not necessarily like people who'll be bad. They're really helpful. So even how do these commoners, how do everyday people at corporations think, and plus how does the big management think, is something that I've learned, and I think it's very helpful.
Thank you. And that leads me to very, very, I would say, important question. And
Yeah.
I really do think like you had a really interesting answer for that. And I'm really curious to also hear this personally. So what led you to decision to leave corporate work and pursue social work?
Um, mm, yeah, I think I answered a bit of that early when I say about the Karl Marx
Ye-
alienation.
Yes, but
I,
I would love to hear more about it.
yeah, I feel like, oh no, I have been so privileged all my life. I feel so guilty. I feel so deeply guilty of how come I am born with so much opportunities. Like, everything is fine. I have good health. I don't have health issues. I have a, I have traveled many countries. I have had I have represented people, and sometimes I wonder if I even am the right fit to represent people, people who are marginalized, because once again, very intersectional identity of privilege. I feel very guilty, and I feel like that guilt kills me a lot. Especially, like, I remember when there were attacks on indigenous communities, and I was just in my air conditioned, very protected workplace. I felt like, why am I, despite being in Dhaka, why am I in such a fancy office room? Just, you know, I could just go home. I could just look away. I could just enjoy a beautiful dinner at a very expensive restaurant. Um, why? But when I think about life in the long run, something that I've learned from my uncle was that life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So it's a long journey. If I'm alive, um, I think at corporates I was very lucky. I I was earning money that helped me survive, but it I didn't want it to continue because I wanted something that would be fulfilling. And now, after working 7 years at corporate, after with so many lessons, I feel like I was ready to do something different. And I felt like the use of self in social work, it was something that stood out to me. The use of self is like where I can use my lived experiences. When you are a social worker, it's you who is the product. It's you who has to use yourself to help someone else. And if I could do that to decrease human suffering as a whole, I think that would be an awesome way to live the rest of my life. Um, I'm not sure. I'm probably in the future, I'm going to be very overwhelmed with emotions. Say, when I see someone who would be, I don't know, say a homeless person, a person who's, if I'm working at, say, a child protection agency, seeing children go through horrible experiences, probably it will break me down. But I feel like this program is going to prepare me to really build the capacity to confront these realities and be with people. So it helps me being a part of the shared human experience where I'm not just, you know, it is in some closed room of a very fancy corporate office, but very connected to people. And I think feeling very connected to people itself is so fulfilling, especially when you're a social animal.
Thank you. And I'm so happy that like you're also pursuing social work. We need more people like you in this field, right? So so glad that like you're exploring social work. So how has relocating to Australia for social work studies shaped your sense of home, belonging, and distance?
It's just been like almost 4 months since I moved to Australia. I just finished a trimester. I'm very grateful. I think moving across continents is a big, big thing, but it's also a matter of, it also shows how privileged I am that I could do this. I feel like I'm God's favorite child, you know? Like I feel like I have everything that I could ever want. One reason I came to Australia was because Australia has its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, which are its first peoples or First Nations, as we say the Indigenous groups of Australia. Their lens is embedded in the curriculum. And as an Indigenous person in Bangladesh, where we do not even have that recognition to be Indigenous, where people are always calling us separatist, um, I was desperately looking for that lens. I was desperately looking for a curriculum that would honor that lens, and I found that in Australia, and that has been life changing. I know things are not perfect, but for example, even having a teacher from First Nations, learning about frontier violence, learning about how colonization is still ongoing, was something that allowed me to feel not disconnected, and it also helped me in feeling solidarity, right? So in Australia, I would say it's quite multicultural. There are people from different countries. It has helped me really come across different worldviews, but especially in social work, it's important to not be judgmental. It's important to practice listening, and to identify listening blocks, for example, whether you are trying to whether your emotional boundaries are being crossed, whether you are assuming people's realities. Because as a social worker, it's not my job to really judge someone, and they might come from a very different value system. So Australia is helping me with that radically in meeting different systems, different people. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm so happy that like you're having your time in Australia, and I would like I really really hope that like the experience would go very smoothly and positive for you. So so what does it mean to choose work that aligns with your values, your community, and your sense of responsibility?
Yeah, there is a fancy word for this. Ikigai. I think, especially when I was working at corporate, um, people would always talk, like, corporate leaders would always talk about ikigai, like sense of purpose and all of that. And somehow they would always match it with some corporate roles. And I would not get it. Like, how do you do that to someone as, like, say, head of financial planning? Um, but I think I'm not sure if I'm going to achieve that here. But I feel like when I walk into my class, when I speak to my peers, my teachers, they speak my language. They speak my language of social justice, of structural realities. They speak of radical pluralism, and that is something that makes me feel very at home and feel very comfortable. So I'm very thankful for that.
Thank you. So. I was expecting a little bit more elaborate answer, but you answered very precisely. But thank you so much. So, okay, so the next question. What silences or gaps still remain when we talk about Indigenous women in Bangladesh, especially those in urban spaces?
In urban spaces. You know, I think there isn't much really. There isn't much literature on urban Indigenous women, definitely. Um, I remember once writing an article on gender-based violence back in 2021 and was published, and some Indigenous guy shared it and said, "How does this woman come? Who is this woman to tell that Indigenous men can oppress Indigenous women? How can she say that? She's so privileged. She's living in Dhaka. She's working at corporates and all of that, right?" And he was questioning my credibility because I wrote about patriarchy within Indigenous communities. So, for example, like when you think about macro issues, as I said earlier, can alter, can change micro realities. For example, Indigenous communities are mostly egalitarian, right? Like men and women took part in economic labor simultaneously together. But because of outside forces, for example, even women's like dresses, clothing have changed. Women cannot go out because of safety and security concerns. So gender relationships have also changed within Indigenous communities. And that has, because of like land grabbing, lack of resources, the power dynamics has also changed. And it's not sweet. And people do not talk about what's happening inside Indigenous communities. And I think that is so important to be talked about, and especially when this community moves to an urban place, when they migrate to an urban place, it's different. It's so it's interesting because when you look at diaspora, right? For example, you will see Onoi, how a Bengali Muslim family, how they operate in Dhaka is very different from how they operate in New York. Some communities can become more conservative, right? They probably wouldn't do so if they were back in home because probably they feel like there is a threat to their identity. They need to preserve their culture. So there isn't much issue talked about that, and how that permeates womanhood is so different. And this women often grow up without a sense of community or without a sense of sisterhood, where they do not see representation or women like themselves, and they do not know how to strategize. And this is the point, especially when they are at an impressionable age, they can make wrong decisions, they can be under wrong influence. And this is something that communities need to understand, because healing is communal. You cannot just like blame women, you cannot just like hate on them and expect to heal, because women bear the brunt. So in that case, these realities come up with, because there are always constantly new factors coming in to these realities, more understanding or research or conversation needs to be held about this very complex, interconnected realities.
Thank you. We have just a couple of more questions left, but we're kind of end of the conversation. So I will let you go that time, no worries. But I'm so enjoying this conversation. So my next question for you is that what forms of care or solidarity feel most meaningful to you at this moment or at this point in your life?
Hmm. Communication. I think, uh, just for a relevant example, imagine Onoi, suppose suppose you lose someone to death today. It's about you, it's your grief, right? I'm here thinking about, oh no, Onoi must be going through a very difficult thing. I don't know what to tell Onoi. So you know what? I'm not even going to say anything to Onoi. I'm just going to hold back. But whether or not you respond to my message, my sending you a message gives you some form of like not being alone, where I can communicate with you that I'm here for you. As Indigenous communities or any oppressed community, we always face so much hatred. Any bit of solidarity makes a big difference. I purposefully, intentionally surround myself with supporters, with allies, because I try to create that reality of mine, because otherwise I would go completely insane. So that kind of communication of people coming up and saying, you, I acknowledge your pain. This must be really painful for you. That clear communication really helps us. But also, efforts like yours, right? For example, people who feel the need that these conversations need to happen, especially during these times of crisis, is also very critical. Especially, I think when during moments like today or during times like this, when there is such misinformation and disinformation, you have to fight back. Like there is such huge propaganda against us. It outnumbers us. I cannot go in and fight Facebook comments, right? But that does not mean I will stop fighting. I'll have to take whatever form of conversation I can stir. And in that case, allies have to step in especially during those times when it becomes critical. You are muted.
Thank you so much. And also, sorry for that. Thank you so much, Mia. So, when you think about the future, your work, your communities, your path, what feels most important?
I don't know. It's such a difficult question. What feels most important? I wouldn't know how to create that hierarchy. I feel like I have learned so much from activists, advocates around me. When I was younger, Onoi, I thought that justice was linear. One day everything is going to be fine. That's it. I'll close my eyes. Everything is going to be fine. It's most like in the movies. But in reality, it's an everyday thing. It's constantly moving. Um, whatever I would say would probably may sound tone deaf if it's taken in a different context. I think I can say something very fancy here right now, but I don't know if those words will ever comfort the family of the girl who was brutally raped this year, who was in the news, right? So what I'm going to say, it just makes sense to me. Um, I think it's a um, without healing you cannot move forward, so you have to there needs to be some form of self-care. I'm not just talking about individual self, community self-care, and I'm not talking about fancy going to the salon and all of that, but I'm saying just time to yourself. um, but to also feel that there is some sense of control over your life. So even when things are going bad, I can still control. I can choose to protest. I can still have my voice. I do not have to agree to people who are marginalizing me. That sense, that sense of mobility, of not being stuck is also very important. So there are like very little progress steps that allows us to keep on going instead of having your voice being completely silenced.
Thank you. And that kind of like lead us to the last question. And the last question for you is there a memory, story, or guiding thread you hold close as you move forward?
Um, when I was growing up, I had like right now, as I say that, I think the only thing that comes to my mind is the face of my grandparents, my paternal grandparents. I had them. They passed away a few years ago. Um, they were very loving. Especially my grandmother. I think they were very different. My grandfather and grandmother in Rangamati. My grandfather has seen many different shifts. land disposition, Kaptai Dam construction, and all of that. Um, but I have also seen my grandmother holding oral traditions, being very big avid readers. And when I was young and I didn't understand much, like they would tell me a lot about the times they had seen in the hill tracts and how they were all different. Like my grandfather would say, if they were not land dispossessed, times would have been so different. I would have, like, say, much more in life. And I could see that pain in their eyes. They passed away, but it's like one of those things that, like, when someone passes away, you think that, oh, this person couldn't see something um, when they were alive. And I feel that a lot for my grandparents because, like, they were absolute sweethearts. They were so loving, and um, in many ways, I feel like when I look at my own features, like my hands, my feet, I could also see how they look like my forefathers, right? I think especially your appearance holds a special meaning when you are born looking different to majority. And I had that as a part of my complex upbringing as well, like coming into terms and accepting my own features, my indigenous features, and all of that. But it also makes me feel very strong because I know this is how my forefathers survived in the hilly region. So I hold that. I feel like very connected to my grandparents, even today.
Oh, thank you so much. Officially, we ran out of questions, but anything you want to like to add to end this conversation? Any last words?
I'm thankful, Honor. I would say, um, I know that you have interviewed Shatidi. I hope to see more Indigenous people, so even especially Indigenous men or from different gender identities, and that reality would really enrich the conversation.
Thank you so much, and you're being so lovely. Thank you so much. So, Mia, thank you for sharing your journey with such care, depth, and honesty. Your work, research, storytelling, and community centered social work continues to expand the landscape of indigenous feminist thought in Bangladesh. As part of Bangladesh Feminist World History Project, your voice will serve as a living resource for future generations navigating identity, movement, belonging, and memory. Thank you, everyone, to who joined with us, and also please subscribe to Bangladesh Feminist Archives YouTube channel and follow us on um, social media accounts like Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, if you do have. So for future episodes, and thank you so much, Mia, and thank you all for being here.